Some doors don't open with keys. They open with a stunning hex at midnight and the terrifying realization that you don't want to close them again. We are about to hear this story right now. The forest had no business being this quiet. Hermione had learned over 2 years of running that silence in a war was never peaceful. It was anticipatory. It was the held breath before the hex, the stillness of air before something tore through it. She had learned to read silence the way she once read books, quickly, thoroughly, with her whole body tensed toward the meaning beneath the surface. Tonight, the silence tasted like frost and pine resin and the particular metallic sharpness that gathered before magic discharged. She stood motionless behind a birch tree whose bark pressed cold ridges into her shoulder through her coat, and she watched the pale figure moving through the clearing 30 meters ahead. She had been following him for 4 days. She had not slept in 31 hours. Her notes, folded into the inner pocket of her coat and already soft at the creases from how many times she had opened and refolded them, told her that Draco Malfoy moved between 3 locations on a rotating schedule: a farmhouse near Wiltshire, a safe house in the Scottish borders, and this forest in Northumberland that had no name on any map she could find. He always came here alone. He always came after midnight. He never stayed longer than 2 hours. She did not know why he came. She had watched him stand in the clearing for 40 minutes last Thursday, without moving, without casting, without anything. Just standing in the dark between the trees with his arms at his sides and his face turned upward. And she had felt, crouched in the undergrowth with her wand in her fist, something uncomfortable move through her chest that she had firmly identified as tactical observation and nothing else whatsoever. She was here for information. That was all this was. Voldemort's movements had become unpredictable in the past 3 weeks. 2 Order safe houses had been found and destroyed. Someone was talking, and it was someone close enough to the inner circle to know specific locations, specific timing, specific magical signatures used to conceal the houses. Hermione had spent 6 days in a library in Edinburgh, a Muggle library which was safer, cross-referencing every piece of intelligence she had, and every thread she pulled led eventually to the same tangle. Someone in Voldemort's orbit was feeding information outward. And Draco Malfoy, who had been conspicuously absent from every significant Death Eater action for the past 4 months, kept appearing at the edge of her calculations like a variable she couldn't account for. She needed to know what he knew. Harry would have told her this was too dangerous. Ron would have told her she'd lost her mind. She had told neither of them, which was a decision she'd made with clear eyes and which she was not second-guessing now, crouched in frozen undergrowth at 1:47 in the morning, with her knees going numb and her breath making small ghosts in the air in front of her face. She was not second-guessing it. She watched him stop in the center of the clearing. He was thinner than she remembered. The last time she had seen Draco Malfoy up close, at the manor, in the drawing room, with Bellatrix's knife. He had been pale and frightened, and she had been too terrified herself to read much more than the broadest strokes of him. Now, from 30 meters in the dark, she could see that thin had become something more architectural, the kind of lean that happened when a person forgot to eat, because other concerns had colonized the space where appetite used to live. His coat was dark and well-made, but the collar was turned up against cold in a way that looked less like fashion and more like instinct, like a creature trying to make itself smaller. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he sat down on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, braced his elbows on his knees, and pressed his face into his hands. Hermione's grip tightened on her wand. This is not the moment, she told herself. Wait. But she had been waiting for 4 days, and she had 31 hours of sleeplessness eroding the edges of her patience, and the intelligence she needed was sitting 10 meters closer than it had ever been, alone, with his face in his hands and his guard so far down it was practically horizontal. She moved. She was good at moving silently. 2 years of practice made good at a great many things she had never wanted to learn. And she covered half the distance before a twig cracked under her left boot, and she saw his head come up, sharp and sudden, and then she was already casting. Stupefy. The spell hit him square in the chest. He went over backward off the log with a sound like something large and startled. And then there was just the hollow echo of his body hitting frozen ground and the ringing aftermath of her own casting in the cold air. And then silence again. Hermione walked forward with her wand still raised, her pulse knocking against the inside of her throat with an insistence that was deeply inconvenient. He lay on his back in the frost-stiffened grass, one arm thrown out, his face turned to the side. The impact had knocked his coat open. In the thin moonlight, she could see the dark mark on his left forearm, livid against the white of his skin, and she looked at it for exactly 1 second before she looked away. She cast the binding spell, watched the conjured cords wrap around his wrists, his ankles. Professional, efficient. She had done this before, twice, with Death Eaters who had found them camping, and she had not let herself think too carefully about what she was doing then either. She crouched and checked his pulse with 2 fingers against the side of his neck, because stunning a malnourished person at close range was not without risk, and she was not, whatever else she was tonight, she was not cavalier about that. His pulse was steady. His skin was very cold. She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment she couldn't entirely account for. Draco Malfoy unconscious was dissonant in a way that she couldn't have anticipated. He looked younger. The particular quality of contempt that had lived on his face for as long as she'd known him was entirely absent, obviously, but it was more than that. Without it, without the habitual architecture of his disdain, he looked like someone who had simply been carrying an enormous amount of weight for an enormous amount of time, and had, just for this moment, put it down. Stop it, she told herself, and stood up. She had a portkey in her coat pocket, a muggled tin of throat lozenges that she had charmed 3 weeks ago for exactly this eventuality, because she had learned to prepare for the things she hoped wouldn't become necessary. She crouched again, tucked it into his bound hands because physical contact with the object was required, and held her own fingers against the cold metal and said the activation word. The world lurched. The safe house was a gamekeeper's cottage in the Scottish borders that had been abandoned since 1987, and that Hermione had spent 11 days preparing with every concealment charm, anti-apparition ward, and detection prevention spell she could research. It that smelled of damp stone and old timber, and the particular quality of enclosed air that accumulated in spaces where no one had breathed for a long time. She had put a camp bed in the back room, a small table, a lamp charmed to give steady light. She had stocked provisions. She had prepared for this. She had not entirely prepared for the reality of a person lying bound on the camp bed in the back room, while she stood in the front room with her back against the wall and her wand loose in her hand, and her legs doing something complicated and structural that required her to slide down the wall until she was sitting on the flagstone floor. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them with a kind of detached, analytical attention. The fine, continuous tremor in her fingers, the way her right hand was white-knuckled around the wand she hadn't holstered, the fact that her palms were damp with cold sweat, despite the fact that the physical exertion had been minimal, and she was, by any objective assessment, entirely safe. She was shaking because she had just stunned and bound and portquayed a person against his will. She was shaking because there was a word for what she had done tonight, and it was not a comfortable word, and she was not going to say it, not even inside her own head, because she knew her reasons, and her reasons were good and necessary, and the alternative was more order safe houses burned and more people dead, and... She pressed her wand against her sternum and breathed. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard him stir. The sounds from the back room were ordinary human waking up sounds. A sharp intake of breath, the rustling shift of someone reorienting to a body. And then a silence that had a different quality to it, the charged stillness of someone assessing rather than sleeping. And then finite. The word was quiet and precise, and nothing happened, because she had anticipated this and keyed the binding to resist dissolution by the bound party. And the silence that followed had a slightly different texture to it. Calculation, she thought. He was calculating. She stood up, straightened her coat, put her wand in her hand with deliberate composure, which was not the same thing as feeling composed, but had, in her experience, a tendency to become it over time. She opened the door. He was sitting upright on the camp bed, with his bound wrists resting on his knees, and his silver eyes finding her face in the lamplight, with an immediacy that told her he had known exactly where she was in the cottage from the moment he woke. His expression was... She had expected fury. She had expected the cold, cutting performance of contempt she remembered from 6 years of proximity to him. What she had not expected was the absolutely flat, stripped quality that his face had instead. Not calm, not controlled, but genuinely entirely empty. As though he had encountered something so far outside the boundaries of anticipated experience that his features had simply declined to comment. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Granger." Not a question, not an accusation, just her name, in a tone she had no prior architecture for. She crossed her arms, keeping the wand visible in her right hand, and made herself hold his gaze. "I need information," she said. Her voice was steady. She was grateful for that, with a disproportionate intensity. "About Voldemort's movements, about the location leaks. I know you know something, and I know you're not telling them, and I need to understand why." Something moved in his expression. Not quite through it, more beneath it, a pressure from the wrong direction, like a current under ice. His eyes dropped to the wand in her hand and came back up. "You stunned me," he said. Still that strange, stripped quiet. Yes. In the forest. Yes. His jaw shifted. You've been watching me. It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. 4 days. The silence that came after that had weight and texture. She could feel the precise moment when calculation finished and something harder replaced it. And she watched his shoulders settle and his chin lift and recognized the gesture from years ago, from a boy in a corridor making himself taller than he was, and felt something in her chest respond to it with a tightness she categorically refused to examine. "I'm not telling you anything," he said. "You will," she said, eventually. His eyes held hers across the small lamplit room with its damp stone walls and its smell of old timber and sealed air. And something in the quality of that held gaze was different from any look he had ever directed at her in 6 years of shared space. Not hatred, not contempt, not the performative dismissal she had catalogued and filed and long since stopped being hurt by. She couldn't name what it was. She found, disturbingly, that she wanted to. "You're going to regret this, Granger," he said at last. She held the door open, kept her face still. "Get some sleep. We'll talk in the morning." She pulled the door closed behind her. In the front room, alone with the lamp she hadn't lit and the dark pressing in at the single window, she stood very still and listened to the sound of her own breathing and told herself with great firmness that whatever she was feeling had a rational explanation and would resolve itself cleanly in the morning. Outside, the frost settled deeper into the ground. The night held its breath. She did not sleep. She made tea at 5 in the morning because there was nothing else useful to do with her hands. The cottage had a small iron stove that she had charmed to light without matches, and she stood over it while the water heated and listened to the silence from behind the closed door and told herself that the listening was purely tactical. She was monitoring. It was responsible captorship. The word arrived in her mind with a small, ugly thud, and she pushed it aside. Responsible oversight to remain attentive to any sounds that might indicate an escape attempt. There were no sounds indicating an escape attempt. There were, in fact, no sounds at all. Whatever Draco Malfoy was doing in the back room, he was doing it with a stillness that she found, perversely, more unsettling than noise would have been. She could manage noise. Noise was information. This quality of absolute quiet felt like a held position, like someone who had decided that giving her nothing was its own form of resistance, and she recognized the tactic because she had used it herself. She poured 2 cups, stood looking at them on the small table. She carried both through. He was sitting exactly where she had left him, upright on the camp bed, bound wrists on his knees, silver eyes finding her immediately as the door opened, as though he had not moved an inch in the 4 hours since she had closed the door on him. The lamplight caught the angles of his face and threw long shadows. He looked at the 2 cups, and something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. A fractional tightening around his eyes that was not quite surprise, and not quite anything she had a clean name for. She set 1 cup on the floor within his reach, took her own cup and sat in the wooden chair she had positioned at the room's far wall, precisely far enough that he could not reach her without standing, and close enough that she could read his face. He looked at the cup for a moment. "Is it poisoned?" he said, flat. No inflection that would tell her whether he was serious. "If I wanted you incapacitated, I wouldn't use tea," she said. "I'm rather more efficient than that, as I think last night demonstrated." Something crossed his face. Not quite amusement, but the shadow of a reflex toward it, quickly suppressed. He leaned forward with the awkward care of bound wrists and picked up the cup, held it in both hands. She watched the faint tremor of the steam against his face and made herself look at her own cup instead. "You watched me for 4 days," he said. Not an opening. More like a man picking up a piece of evidence and turning it over. "Yes. And you didn't see anything worth acting on until last night." "I saw a great deal worth noting. Last night was the first opportunity that minimized risk. To you. Obviously, to me." He drank. She watched him register the warmth of it, the almost imperceptible way his shoulders dropped a fraction, the involuntary quality of it, and the way he caught himself immediately and reinstated the precise posture he had been holding. She filed this away with the same careful attention she applied to everything, and told herself it was purely strategic intelligence gathering, and that the small, inconvenient tug of something like recognition she felt watching him compose himself was entirely irrelevant. "What do you think I know?" he said. "I think you know who's been feeding location information to Voldemort's inner circle." A pause. Not a surprised pause. A measuring one. "And what makes you think I'd tell you?" "You've been absent from every significant Death Eater action for 4 months," she said. "You come to a nameless forest alone after midnight, and you stand in the dark for 40 minutes at a time, not casting anything. You're not patrolling, you're not meeting anyone, you're not conducting reconnaissance. You're..." She stopped. "You're somewhere else in your head." His eyes came to hers with a sharpness that had real weight behind it. "Careful, Granger," he said softly. "I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you. I'm telling you what I observed." She kept her voice even. "You know something you're not acting on. I want to know what it is. Those are the terms. And when you have your information." She had prepared an answer for this. She delivered it cleanly. "I release you. Obliviate the location of this safe house from your memory. You go back to wherever you came from." The silence that followed had a particular density. He looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression she could not read at all, which was itself information, because she could read most people, and the fact that she could not read him produced in her a friction that she could feel in her sternum. "You'd obliviate me," he said. "It's not personal, it's practical." "It's never personal with you, is it?" The edge in it was not quite contempt. It was something more specific, more aimed. She felt it land precisely where it was directed, somewhere between her ribs, and kept her face still with the practice of long discipline. "Drink your tea," she said. She did not question him that first day. She had not planned it that way. She had planned to begin extraction of information within 12 hours, methodical and efficient. But something about the way the morning light came through the single window and found him sitting in it, the pallor of him, the architectural thinness she had noted in the forest, now more visible in daylight, made her revise the timeline without fully articulating to herself why. She told herself he needed rest to be coherent. This was operationally sound reasoning. She did not examine it further. Instead, she moved through the cottage doing the practical work of habitation, checking the wards, replenishing the concealment charms that required daily renewal, cataloguing her provisions. He watched her. She could feel it, the quality of his attention following her movements with a consistency that should have been unnerving, and was instead. She had no clean word for what it was instead, which was itself unnerving. At midday, she brought him food. Bread, hard cheese, dried fruit. The cottage's provisions were not elegant. He looked at the plate and then at her and said, "You're going to need to deal with these," and held up his bound wrists. She looked at them, looked at him. "If I loosen the binding," she said carefully, "I want you to understand that the anti-apparition wards on this location extend 300 meters in every direction. You cannot walk out of them faster than I can stun you again. The door has a seal that will alert me to any attempt to breach it, and I haven't slept in." She did a rapid calculation. 37 hours, which means I am operating on pure adrenaline and stress, and in my experience, that particular cocktail makes my reflexes rather faster than usual. Something in his expression shifted. Again that fractional, suppressed response that she couldn't quite categorize. "That's a very thorough threat." "It's a briefing," she said. "There's a difference." She loosened the binding to give his hands freedom of movement, while keeping a secondary ward threaded through that would tighten immediately if he raised either hand above shoulder height. He registered this. She saw it in the careful, exploratory way he flexed his fingers, testing the parameters, and said nothing. He ate. She sat in the chair. Outside, rain had begun to move across the hills, and the sound of it on the cottage roof was steady and low and oddly domestic. And she thought, "I have kidnapped Draco Malfoy, and now I am sitting with him in the rain, listening to him eat bread, and I have not slept in 37 hours, and I have absolutely no idea what I am doing." She knew, intellectually, what she was doing. She had a plan. The plan was sound. She pushed the other thought down and watched the rain streak the window. "Why the forest?" she said. She hadn't meant to say it. It arrived without planning. He looked up. "The Northumberland forest," she clarified, and heard herself doing it, the reflexive overspecification of someone trying to sound like they'd meant to ask a practical question. "You go there every week. I need to understand if it's a meeting point, or it's not a meeting point. Then what is it?" He held her gaze for a long moment with those pale eyes that gave nothing away and gave everything away simultaneously, which was a contradiction she was too tired to resolve. "Somewhere they're not," he said. The simplicity of it sat in the rain sound of the room. She thought of the way he had pressed his face into his hands on the log in the dark, the particular quality of exhaustion in the gesture, and felt the friction in her sternum again, that low, uncomfortable pull of something she was rigidly declining to call empathy. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll begin properly tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment longer. "You should sleep, Granger. You look terrible." It was not delivered with cruelty. That was the thing that caught her entirely off guard. It was delivered with the flat, observational tone of a person stating a fact, and she stood up and took the plate and left the room because the alternative was sitting there, trying to pass the quality of his voice. And she was too tired for that, too dangerously, bone-deep tired for any of this. She set the plate in the small basin and leaned on the counter and pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the wall above it. Somewhere there not. She thought about what it meant to have nowhere in the world that wasn't occupied by something terrible. She had had that once. The hunted, hollowed-out months of camping in a succession of nowhere places, and she remembered the specific texture of that particular loneliness, the way it had weight and temperature both. She pressed her eyes closed. She was not doing this. She was not standing in a safe house kitchen at midday, finding points of identification with her prisoner, who was Draco Malfoy, who had called her mudblood so many times the word had worn grooves in her memory, who had stood in a drawing room while Bellatrix. She stopped that thought with the practice of long habit. She was here for information. She had a plan. The plan was sound. She slept for 4 hours on the front room floor with her back against the wall and her wand in her hand, and woke to the sound of rain still moving over the roof, and the lamp in the back room visible as a thin line of gold under the closed door. He was still there, still quiet. She lay in the dark for a moment with the rain on the roof and the thin gold line and her own heartbeat, and thought, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" Not about the plan, not about the information, but about the tea at 5 in the morning, the loosened binding, the question she hadn't meant to ask. She stood up, rolled her shoulders, rebraided her hair with quick, definitive movements. She was Hermione Granger. She had walked into a forest at midnight and done what needed doing. She had prepared and planned, and she had a purpose here, and she was going to execute it with the same discipline she applied to everything, and whatever else was accumulating in the corners of this small, damp cottage. Whatever was threading itself through the spaces between sentences and cups of tea and rain on windows, she was going to manage it the same way she managed everything. She opened her notes, read them through twice, made 3 amendments. When the thin line of gold under the door went dark, she was still sitting at the table, reading by wandlight, building tomorrow's questions with the careful architecture of someone who understood that the right question, asked at the right moment, could open anything. She did not acknowledge, even to herself, that she had listened for his breathing to slow before she finally let her shoulders drop. The rain moved steadily over the hills. The cottage held its silence around them both. The morning came in grey and without ceremony. Hermione was already at the table when the light changed. She had been there for an hour, her notes spread before her, her 3rd cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. She had spent the pre-dawn hours constructing her approach with the same methodical attention she had once given to exam preparation, which felt, in the thin early light, like a comparison that said something unflattering about her. She pushed the thought aside. She had a list of questions ordered by strategic priority. She had anticipated deflections and prepared redirections. She was ready. She was not ready for him to open the door himself. She had warded it to permit egress. She had decided, sometime in the small hours, that keeping him sealed in would create an adversarial dynamic that would impede the extraction of information, and that controlled freedom of movement within the cottage was tactically sounder. But she had not expected him to use it at 6:30 in the morning, and she looked up from her notes with a composure that was approximately 2 seconds behind where she needed it to be. He stood in the doorway in yesterday's clothes, his hair without its usual severity, falling slightly across his forehead in a way that made him look. She returned her eyes to her notes immediately. "There's tea," she said. He crossed to the stove without speaking. She listened to the small sounds of him finding a cup, pouring, and tracked him in her peripheral vision as he turned and surveyed the front room with the same measuring quality of attention she had felt from him yesterday. Systematic, thorough, missing nothing. His gaze stopped on her notes. "Sit down," she said. "Not there." She indicated the chair across the table rather than the one beside her. He looked at the chair, looked at her, sat in the one beside her. She absorbed this without reacting and moved her notes 3 inches to the left. "We're going to talk about the location leaks," she said. "Good morning to you too, Granger." The tone was... She paused internally, cataloguing it. Not warm, not the acid contempt she remembered. Something that occupied the narrow territory between them with a quality she couldn't yet classify. She kept her eyes on her notes. 2 order safe houses in the last 6 weeks, she said. 12 people displaced. 3 injured during the evacuation of the second one. The magical signatures used to find them were specific, not general dark detection, targeted unraveling of concealment charms that required knowledge of the specific spell work used. Someone with access to that information is passing it along. Silence. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression that had very little surface to it. Not closed exactly, but compressed, like a letter folded too many times. His cup was in both hands, and his elbows were on the table, and he was looking at her with those pale eyes that caught the grey morning light and held it. "You already know who it is," she said. His jaw moved. Nothing else. "Malfoy. Careful what conclusions you draw from a silence, Granger. I'm drawing them from 4 days of observation and 6 years of knowing exactly how you perform disengagement when you're actually engaged," she said, and heard herself say it, and felt the slight internal lurch of having said more than she'd planned. Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not the kind of shift that announced itself, but the kind that happened in the deeper layers, in the structure beneath expression. He set his cup down. 6 years, he repeated quietly. "It's not a compliment," she said. "It's an observation." "No," he said. "It never is with you." The edge in it this time was different from yesterday's, less aimed, more reflexive, the kind of thing that emerged from habit rather than intention. She recognized the distinction and found, to her considerable irritation, that it mattered to her. She returned to her notes. The second safe house, the one in Devon, was concealed with a layered Fidelius variant that only 4 people knew the specifications of. 3 of them are beyond suspicion. The 4th has a brother currently residing in Wiltshire who visits on a rotating schedule that matches. "Rowell," he said. She stopped. "Thaddeus Rowell," he said, in the same flat, stripped tone he had used to say her name the night she'd brought him here. "He's been passing information for 7 weeks. Not ideologically. He wants out, and he's buying his way out with whatever he can carry. He doesn't know enough to be useful much longer, which means in approximately 2 weeks, Voldemort will decide he's a liability rather than an asset." The room held the information for a moment, like water finding its level. "How do you know this?" she said carefully. He picked his cup back up, looked at the middle distance. "Because I was in the room when it was discussed." "You were—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You're still attending inner circle meetings." "Occasionally, when absence would be more conspicuous than presence." She looked at him, really looked, with the analytical attention she usually reserved for texts she was trying to understand from the inside out, and saw something she had not fully registered until this moment. The specific quality of his exhaustion was not physical. It was the exhaustion of sustained performance, of being, for an extended and indeterminate period, someone else in rooms full of people who would kill you if they knew. She thought, "Oh." She did not say it. She looked back at her notes and wrote Raoul, Thaddeus, 7 weeks. Inner circle discussion in the margin in her smallest handwriting, and kept her face at the temperature of professional focus, and said, "What else do you know?" He told her, "Not everything." She understood that, felt the shape of what he was withholding, the way you felt the shape of furniture in a dark room by the spaces around it. But more than she had anticipated, and with a specificity that told her he had been holding it carefully, the way you held something fragile, waiting for a moment when setting it down wouldn't shatter it. She wrote. He talked. The grey morning brightened incrementally outside the single window, and the rain had stopped in the night, and the hills beyond the glass were the pale gold of winter grass under thin cloud. And somewhere in the 3rd hour of this, she noticed that the table between them had a different quality to it. Not smaller, not warmer, but less absolute. Less like a boundary and more like a surface they were both working at. She noticed this and said nothing about it. It was the afternoon when it happened, and she was entirely unprepared for it because she had been focused on the wrong thing. She had been rereading her notes from the morning session, cross-referencing Draco's information against her existing intelligence map, making the small, precise connections that accumulated into pattern. And she had been so absorbed in the work that she had lost track of him. He had been quiet for 40 minutes at the far end of the room, and she had allowed herself to stop monitoring and simply work, which was its own kind of evidence of something she wasn't examining. She heard the sound before she registered what it meant. The specific, sharp intake of breath that a person made when pain arrived without warning. She looked up. He was standing at the window. His left sleeve had ridden up. He must have pushed it back without thinking, some habitual gesture. And he was looking at his own forearm with an expression that she felt enter her chest like a splinter, small and specific, and immediately disproportionately painful. The dark mark was moving. She had heard it did this, that when Voldemort summoned, or when something shifted in the dark network of it, it moved against the skin like something alive. And she had heard it, but seeing it was different, entirely different, the black lines writhing with a slow, deliberate cruelty that made her stomach turn, and his face. His face was the face of someone who had learned not to show what was being done to them. That was what she saw, and it was the specific arrangement of controlled anguish that she recognized from mirrors, from the months of the hunt when she had practiced the same architecture of her own features. Do not let it show. Do not give it the satisfaction of showing. She was across the room before she had decided to move. "Let me see," she said. He turned from the window with a speed that was almost defensive, his sleeve coming down, his expression resetting, the whole elaborate machinery of his composure slamming back into place with a speed that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so bleak. It's fine. It's clearly not fine. She kept her voice at the same even register she used for everything. I have dittany, and a numbing charm that won't interfere with the marks, with whatever it's doing. I don't need Malfoy. Something in her voice. She didn't know what, some quality she hadn't put there deliberately, stopped him. He looked at her with that compressed expression, the one that had too much in it and showed none of it, and she held out her hand palm up. Show me. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then, with a movement that had something wrenching in its slowness, he pushed his sleeve back. She looked at the mark, made herself look at it clinically, the inflammation of the skin around it, the heat radiating from it, the way it sat on him like something inserted rather than drawn. She reached into her coat pocket for her wand and cast the numbing charm with precise economy, 3 small movements, and watched the tightness around his eyes reduce by a fraction. She was very aware of the proximity. She was standing close enough to feel the warmth that came off him despite the cold of the cottage, close enough that when he exhaled she could hear it, and her own breathing had developed a quality she was monitoring carefully and declining to acknowledge. She stepped back, put her wand away, looked at her notes across the room. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, very quiet. She had never heard him say them to her before, not in 6 years, not once. And they sat in the room with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to their size. She nodded once, crossed back to the table, sat down. She picked up her quill, put it down, picked it up again, wrote 3 words in the margin of her notes, and then looked at them and realized they were not words related to role or inner circle meetings or concealment charms. She crossed them out with 3 firm strokes. Behind her, she heard him settle back into the chair at the far wall. The thin winter light moved across the flagstone floor between them. Neither spoke for a long time, and the silence had a quality she had not felt in this cottage before. Not the silence of 2 people managing a hostile proximity, but something more complicated and less categorizable, something that breathed. She stared at her notes. She had what she had come for. The information was there in her careful, small handwriting, Raoul's name and the threading details that would let the order act. And she should already be thinking about how to use it, where to send it, how to get word to Harry without revealing the means of acquisition. She should be thinking about that. She was thinking about the way he had looked at his own arm, the practice of it, the long discipline of looking at something being done to you as though it was simply weather. She turned a page, found a clean margin, began writing again, and made very certain she was writing intelligence this time, specific and actionable and entirely professional. Outside the window, the pale winter hills held their cold gold light until the sun dropped and the darkness came back in, unhurried, from the east. She did not look at him again until she heard him say, very quietly, from across the room, "You should eat something." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have architecture for yet. "So should you," she said, and something happened then in the room, some fractional atmospheric shift, some very small and probably meaningless thing that felt afterward like the first movement of a door that had been sealed for a very long time, opening not with drama, but with the quiet, inevitable patience of something that had simply been waiting for the right pressure applied at the right place. She got up to see what was left in the provisions. He followed. She found him reading her books, not her intelligence notes, those she kept in the inner pocket of her coat with a locking charm she renewed every morning, but the 3 novels she had packed in a moment of what she had privately called optimism and publicly called contingency planning. They were battered paperbacks, muggle ones, the kind that had been read so many times the spines had given up, and the pages had developed a softness that was almost textile. She had packed them because the safe house had no library, and she had known, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent 2 years in tents, that an unoccupied mind in an enclosed space became its own kind of enemy. She had not packed them for him. He was sitting in the chair at the far wall with the lamp angled over his shoulder and one of the novels open in his hands, and he was reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who had found, unexpectedly, a room they hadn't known they needed. His long fingers held the pages with a carefulness that she recognized, the handling of someone who had been taught to treat books as objects of value, as she had, though she suspected their educations on this point had arrived from entirely different directions. She stood in the doorway for a moment he wasn't aware of. She was aware that she was standing in the doorway for a moment he wasn't aware of, and that this was the 3rd time in 4 days she had caught herself observing him outside the parameters of strategic intelligence gathering, and that the intervals between such moments were getting shorter rather than longer, which was a trend she needed to address with some urgency. She crossed the room and sat at the table and opened her notes. "Did you sleep?" she said, without looking up. "Some." He turned a page. "You?" Enough. This was not true. She had slept approximately 3 hours, waking twice from the particular kind of dream that arrived in high-stress periods. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams with the quality of wrongness, of rooms with too many doors, of voices just below the threshold of comprehension. She had lain in the dark, listening to his breathing through the wall, and told herself she was monitoring, and eventually given up and read by wandlight, until the grey began at the window. "This is good," he said. She looked up despite herself. He was still looking at the book. "The novel," he said. "I didn't expect it to be." "What did you expect?" "Something instructive." A pause. "Everything you own has the quality of serving a purpose." She looked at him. He was still reading, or performing reading. She couldn't determine which. "Books serve multiple purposes simultaneously," she said. "That's rather the point of them." He turned another page. "Even these ones. There's no practical intelligence in a Victorian romance novel, Granger." She felt warmth arrive in her face and was furious at it. "I packed what I packed." "I know." Still reading. "I'm not criticizing." The absence of criticism in his voice was its own kind of disorienting. She returned to her notes and stared at the lines of her own handwriting until they reassembled into meaning. On the 5th day, she made a mistake. It was small, operationally, She had been rechecking the anti-apparition wards on the cottage's eastern boundary and had let her attention narrow to the spellwork, which was intricate and required precise focus. And she had not heard him come up behind her until he was close enough that when she turned, startled, her elbow connected sharply with his chest, and she lost her balance on the uneven ground, and his hands came up. Instinct, not intention, she understood that immediately, and caught her by the upper arms. 3 seconds. 4. She was aware of his hands through the fabric of her coat with a specificity that was entirely disproportionate to the situation. She was aware of the exact distance between their faces, closer than it had been at any point in their proximity, closer than she had permitted, and she had been very deliberate about proximity, and of the temperature of his breath in the cold air between them, and of the fact that his expression had done something she couldn't categorize, something that lasted approximately the same 3 or 4 seconds before his hands dropped and he stepped back. "Sorry," he said, clipped. "You were falling." "I know," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, with a slightly desperate pride of someone who had very little else to be proud of in this moment. "Thank you." He had already turned away. She finished the ward check with meticulous attention and went back inside and made tea and stood over the stove for considerably longer than the heating required and had a very firm internal conversation with herself about the operational parameters of this situation and what she was and was not going to permit to develop within them. The conversation was thorough and well-reasoned. She was not confident it had worked. That evening, he told her about the manor without her asking. They had been sitting in the particular silence that had become, over 5 days, a different kind of thing than silence usually was. Not absence, but presence. Not emptiness, but a quality of shared occupation that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply begun, cautiously, to inhabit. She had been writing. He had finished the novel and had been looking at the window for a long time, not at what was outside it, but at the darkness of it, the way you looked at a surface when you were actually looking inward. "There was a cellar," he said. She stopped writing. "At the manor, during last year." His voice had the quality she had come to associate with things he said that cost him something. Very even, very precise, as though the control of the delivery could offset the content. "They kept people there. I knew. I was in the house, and I knew, and I—" He stopped. She did not move. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had learned when silence was the most active thing you could offer, that moving would break whatever had made this possible. "I didn't go down," he said. "Not once. I told myself there was nothing I could do. That going down would only—" A pause. "I was 16 when I took the mark. I want you to understand that's not— I'm not offering it as mitigation. I know what it is and what it isn't." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the dark window with the precise, deliberate focus of someone who had chosen a fixed point to look at, because the alternative was looking at something that moved. "I know what they did to you," he said, very quietly. "At the manor, in the drawing room, I was there." The room did something. The air in it, the particular quality of this small, damp space with its stone walls and its single lamp, shifted in a way that was not quite sound and not quite physical, but that she felt in the lining of her throat and behind her eyes. She had not spoken about the manor. Not to Harry, not to Ron, not to anyone. She had packed it into a sealed interior room and put every available piece of herself against the door and kept it there with the same fierce discipline she applied to everything that threatened to undo her. She did not talk about the drawing room. She did not talk about the knife and the floor and the voice above her and the specific register of Bellatrix's delight. "You didn't do it," she said. Her voice was careful, surgical. "I was there," he said again. "You didn't identify me. When she asked you, when they brought us in, you said you weren't sure. You said you couldn't." "Don't," he said. "I'm not absolving you of anything. I'm stating a fact. It's not." He stopped. His jaw moved. "I said I wasn't sure because I was a coward, because I was afraid of what it meant, of what they'd do to me if I was wrong, not because I was—" "I know," she said. He looked at her then, finally. The lamplight caught him fully, and she saw what the controlled voice had been managing. Not quite grief, not quite guilt, something older and more structural than either of those, something that had been living in him for long enough that it had become load-bearing. She thought about saying something measured and intelligent. She thought about the operational parameters she had outlined to herself over the stove that afternoon. She said, "I used to wake up hearing it, her voice, past tense. It's mostly past tense now." Something happened in his face that she did not try to name. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words again. Different weight this time. Different shape entirely. She nodded once. Outside the window, the dark hills held their cold, patient silence. Inside, the lamp burned steadily, and the shadow it made of him on the stone wall was long and still. And she sat with this new weight distributed between them, and found that it was, strangely, easier to carry distributed than it had been carried alone. She picked up her quill, did not write anything, put it down. "The novel," she said after a while. "What did you make of the ending?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, his voice had come back from wherever it had gone. Not fully. There was still something raw at the edge of it, a quality she found she wanted to be careful with. "Inevitable," he said. From the 2nd chapter, everything pointed to it. You could feel it assembling. Most people don't notice it until the penultimate chapter. Most people aren't paying the right kind of attention. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp burned between them, and the dark pressed at the window from outside, and something in the room had a new quality to it, something that had not been there yesterday or the day before. She could not have named it under examination, but she felt it with the specific physical certainty of something that had changed the air pressure in the room, something that had shifted the quality of the space between 2 people from managed distance to something more ungoverned and considerably more complicated. She looked back at her notes. Her handwriting swam very slightly. She blinked it steady. "There are 2 more," she said. "Novels, if you wanted." The pause before he answered was brief, but she was paying the right kind of attention, and she felt it. "Yes," he said. "All right." She got up to find them in her bag, and she kept her face arranged very carefully, and she did not examine the particular quality of warmth that had taken up residence somewhere beneath her sternum with anything resembling the scrutiny it deserved. She handed him the books. Their fingers did not touch. She noticed that they didn't. The radio changed everything. She had kept it on low. a wizarding wireless frequency that broadcast coded order updates, the signal disguised as weather reports, certain phrases meaning certain things that she had memorized the way she memorized everything, completely and without effort. For 6 days, it had been background, a reassurance of connection to the world outside the cottage's warded walls. And she had listened to it the way you listen to rain, present but undemanding. On the morning of the 6th day, the voice on the wireless said, "Scattered showers expected to clear by midday, all clear over the Highland regions." She knew what it meant. She had written the code herself 3 months ago in a safe house in Wales with Harry asleep across the room. All clear over the Highland regions meant the Order had acted on intelligence received. It meant rule had been taken. It meant the location leaks were sealed. It meant she had what she had come for. She stood at the stove with her cup in both hands and listened to the voice move on to other forecasts and felt the coded message settle into her chest with a weight she had not anticipated. She had anticipated relief. She had anticipated the clean, purposeful momentum of a plan reaching its conclusion. She had not anticipated the specific quality of stillness that arrived instead. Not relief, not momentum, but something that had no name she was willing to give it, that sat in her sternum like a stone and did not move. She heard him stir in the back room, the small sounds of morning, the shift of weight, the quiet exhale of someone surfacing from sleep. She had learned the sounds of him over 6 days, the way you learned the sounds of a house, involuntarily, through simple, sustained proximity. And the fact that she could now identify the specific quality of his waking from the other side of a wall was information she had nowhere useful to put. She should tell him. That was the next step in the plan. She should tell him the objective had been achieved, outline the obliviation procedure, release him. Clean and professional. She had prepared for this. She had the modified memory charm ready, practiced it twice in the pre-dawn hours with her wand on a conjured test surface, knew exactly which memories to excise, the location, the approach route, any identifying details of the cottage's interior. She poured a second cup, stood looking at it. He opened the door. He had, over 6 days, stopped hesitating in doorways. She had noted this without commenting on it, the way he had gradually ceased performing the careful, permission-seeking quality of someone moving through a space that wasn't theirs, and had begun simply moving through it, the way you moved through somewhere you had begun, unconsciously, to treat as habitable. He came to the stove now with the easy economy of established routine, reached past her for the kettle, and she stepped aside, and he poured, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And that was also something she had noted without commenting on. The way their silences had changed quality, had lost the charged adversarial static of the first days, and become something more ungoverned, more simply 2 people in the same space in the early morning before the day had fully assembled itself. "Something happened," he said, not a question. She looked at him. He was watching her with those pale eyes that had become, over 6 days, considerably more readable to her than she had expected or planned for. "The wireless," she said. "This morning, the Order acted on the intelligence. Raoul has been taken." He absorbed this. His cup was halfway to his mouth, and it stopped there for a moment before he continued the movement and drank and set it down. "So," he said, "so, the objective has been achieved." She kept her voice at the register she used for statements of plain fact. "I have what I came for." The room held this. "Right," he said. His voice was even, uninflected. She had learned over 6 days that uninflected meant the opposite of what it appeared to mean, that the removal of all colour from his voice was itself a colour, a specific and deliberate one, and that it arrived when something had landed that he was choosing not to let show. "I want to explain the obliviation procedure," she said. "It's a modified charm, targeted, not broad. You won't lose anything except the location on the route here. Your other memories of this period will be intact," he said. "Yes. I'll remember everything except where you are." "That's correct." He turned his cup in his hands, one slow rotation. "And then I go back." "Yes. To Wiltshire, to the meetings, to—" He stopped. His jaw shifted. "Back. I can provide documentation," she said, and heard herself say it, heard the desperate practicality of it, the reflex toward the useful and the concrete when the alternative was standing in this kitchen with what was actually in the room. "If there are questions about your absence, a cover story with verifiable—" "Granger." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression she had no prior architecture for and had been building toward for 6 days, accumulating in small pieces she had refused to assemble. The quality of his attention when she spoke, the way he had followed her to the kitchen on the 3rd evening, the specific weight of all right when she had offered him the novels, the 2 words, "Thank you," that had sat in the room for hours afterward. She looked at her notes, straightened them. They did not need straightening. "I'll prepare the charm," she said, "this afternoon." She did not prepare the charm that afternoon. She told herself she was reviewing her intelligence documentation first, ensuring the record was complete before she closed the operation. This was reasonable. This was professionally sound. She sat at the table with her notes spread before her and wrote with great thoroughness, and did not look at him where he sat at the far wall with the 3rd novel open in his hands, and did not think about the fact that he had not turned a page in 40 minutes. The afternoon light was the pale amber of winter sun through cloud, and it moved across the flagstone floor between them in a slow diagonal, and she followed it with the peripheral attention she was not directing at her notes, and at some point she became aware that he was no longer pretending to read. "Ask me," he said. She looked up. He had set the book down. He was looking at her with the directness he had deployed only rarely over 6 days, the moments when the compression of his expression gave way to something underneath it, something that had no performance in it. "Whatever you've been not asking me all afternoon, ask it." She held his gaze for a moment, set down her quill. "What will you do," she said, "when you go back?" Something moved through his face. "The same thing I've been doing, which is surviving." The word had no self-pity in it. That was the thing. It arrived as pure statement, as simple description of a condition, and that simplicity was somehow worse than self-pity would have been. Keeping my head down, waiting for something to change. "The war could go on for months," she said. "Another year. Longer. I know. And you'll just—" "Yes," he said. "Granger. Yes. There is nothing else." She looked at him. at the specific quality of his exhaustion, which she had been cataloguing since the first morning, and which she now understood completely, because she was looking at someone who had been surviving in the pure, stripped sense of the word. Not living, not building, not hoping, simply continuing, for long enough that continuation had become its own kind of prison. She said, before she had properly decided to, "You could stay." The silence that followed had a texture she felt against her skin. His expression did not change. That was the worst of it. The absolute stillness of him in the moment after she said it. The way nothing moved in his face, as though he had been waiting for something to arrive. And now that it had, he didn't know what shape to take around it. "Granger, the cottage is secure. You know it's secure. You've checked every ward yourself. Don't think I didn't notice." She kept her voice even, clinical. She was making an argument, not a confession, and the distinction was important, and she was holding it with both hands. "You have information I haven't fully extracted yet. There may be more you haven't thought to offer because you didn't know what was relevant. It's operationally sound to..." "Stop," he said quietly. She stopped. He stood up, crossed to the window, stood with his back to her, looking at the pale winter hills, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the careful set of his spine, and felt the air in the room doing something she had no vocabulary for. "Don't dress it up," he said. "If you're going to say something, say it plainly." Her heart was doing something inconvenient and structural. She pressed the back of her hand briefly to her sternum, a gesture so small and automatic, she was almost unaware of making it. "I don't want to obliviate you," she said. He was very still at the window. "I don't want to remove..." She stopped, started again, more carefully. "The procedure is targeted. I know exactly what it would take. And what it would take is..." She looked at her notes. At the 6 days of careful, small handwriting. At somewhere they're not in the margin of page 1, which she had never crossed out. "It would take the last 6 days, which I find I'm not." "Granger." His voice was strange. She had not heard it like this before. "Willing to do," she finished. He turned from the window. She had expected. She didn't know what she had expected. Something guarded, something armored, the particular quality of withdrawal she had watched him deploy twice before when something got too close. She had prepared for that. She had her next argument ready. He was not guarded. He was looking at her with his face completely open in a way she had not seen on him in 6 years, possibly ever. Something underneath all the compression and the control that was simply undefended, him. And it was so unexpected and so complete that she felt her own carefully maintained composure develop a fracture somewhere in its lower architecture. "What are you saying?" he said, very carefully, as though the words required handling. "I'm saying..." She stopped, looked at him, abandoned the clinical register entirely because it had stopped working, and they both knew it. "I don't know exactly what I'm saying. That's honest. You're never not sure of things." "I'm frequently not sure of things. I'm just usually sure of things before I say them." Something happened in his expression then. The fracture of something, the release of a long-held tension, and she watched it move through him with the same helpless attention she had been directing at him for 6 days. He crossed the room, stopped 2 feet from her, which was closer than the parameters she had set on the first day, and nowhere near as close as the afternoon in the yard when his hands had caught her arms and she had spent the following hours not thinking about. The obliviation, he said. I won't do it, she said, unless you ask me to. And if I don't ask, then you stay. A beat. Or you leave and you know where this cottage is, and I trust you not to. You trust me. The words landed between them with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to their brevity. She heard them arrive and watched him hear them arrive, and neither of them moved. Apparently, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment with those pale eyes that had become, over 6 days, one of the things she knew best in the world, and she held his gaze with her hands perfectly still on the table, and her composure doing its level best and not entirely succeeding. I'll stay, he said. The lamp burned steadily between them. The winter hills held their cold outside the window. She nodded once, reached for her quill, and turned to a fresh page in her notes. Her handwriting, when she began, was not quite as steady as usual. She did not comment on this. Neither did he. 3 days after she should have let him go, someone found them. Not Voldemort's people. She registered that immediately, her wand in her hand before the detection ward had finished its alert, reading the magical signature with the rapid triage of someone for whom threat assessment had become as automatic as breathing. Not Death Eaters. The signature was order, which should have been a relief, and was instead something more complicated, arriving in her chest with a cold specificity that told her, before she had consciously processed why, that this was going to be bad in a different way. She said, "Stay inside," to Draco, who was already on his feet and already reading her face, and went to the door. It was Ron. He was standing 10 feet from the cottage in the frost-pale morning with his wand in his hand and his jaws set and his eyes. She saw it immediately, the sequence of it. First relief at finding her, then confusion at the warded door, then his gaze going past her to the window, and she watched the understanding arrive in his face, like weather moving across an open field, unmistakable and total. Hermione. His voice was very careful, the careful of someone managing something large. Ron, tell me he's not in there. She held the door, said nothing. The silence told him everything her voice had declined to. He crossed the distance between them in 4 strides, not pushing past her. He stopped at the threshold, one hand braced on the door frame, and looked through the gap she had left, and she watched him see Draco standing in the middle of the room, and watched something move through Ron's face that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but occupied the territory where they met. How long? He said. 9 days. He turned to look at her with an expression she had seen on him before, the specific configuration of hurt and fury that she had earned twice in their friendship, both times at significant cost. 9 days. And you, Hermione, you didn't... He stopped, pressed a hand to the back of his neck. Harry's been... We didn't know where you were. We thought something had happened. We've been... I know. I'm sorry. I couldn't contact you without risking the location. The wards are keyed to... Don't, he said, quietly, which was worse than loudly. Don't do the thing where you explain yourself at me. I've had 9 days of imagining. He stopped again. She saw the effort it cost him. Come inside, she said. With him. Ron. He looked at her for a moment with those honest, readable eyes that had always been one of the things she trusted most about him, and she watched him make a decision she could see him making, the choice to hold the larger thing in reserve until he understood what he was dealing with, which was a maturity she recognized and was grateful for, and which she knew had its own debt attached. He came inside. The three of them occupied the small front room with the quality of elements that had not been designed to coexist, and she felt the specific atmospheric pressure of it, the way Ron's presence restructured the cottage's interior, made visible by contrast everything that had been developing in his absence. She could see the cottage through his eyes, suddenly. 2 cups on the table, her notes with their dense margins, the 3 novels on the far chair with their cracked spines, the general quality of an inhabited space that had been inhabited by more than one person for long enough that its surfaces had accumulated the evidence of cohabitation. She watched Ron see all of this. She watched him look at Draco. Draco had not spoken. He was standing against the far wall with his arms loosely at his sides, and his face in the compressed, uninflected arrangement she recognized as his response to conditions that required endurance rather than engagement. And she felt, watching him hold himself like that, watching him offer nothing, give nothing, stand there and absorb Ron's assessment with the stillness of something that had learned to be very patient under examination. She felt the fracture in her own composure deepen by a degree she chose not to measure. Malfoy, Ron said. Weasley. The syllables between them were like stones placed with precision, not thrown, placed. She had heard them exchange worse in 6 years of shared space, but this was different, the precision of it, and she thought, Ron can see it. He walked in here, and he can already see something. And I haven't said anything. I haven't done anything. And still, he can see it. Someone want to explain to me, Ron said, looking at neither of them specifically, and both of them generally. What exactly has been happening in this cottage for 9 days? Intelligence extraction, Hermione said. Ron looked at her. The look had layers she could read completely. She had known him since she was 11, and she could read him the way she could read her own handwriting. The top layer said, I want to believe you. The layer underneath said, I don't. And you needed 9 days for that. The information required time to... Granger, Draco said. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the open vulnerability of 3 nights ago when he had said, I'll stay, not the controlled compression of his public face. Something in between, something that had both qualities at once, that was armored and honest simultaneously. Tell him the truth. The room held this for a moment. Ron's eyes moved between them. She straightened her sleeve cuff, then straightened the other one. She was aware of doing it and couldn't stop. I extracted the intelligence on day 2, she said. The Order acted on it 3 days ago. Raoul has been taken and the location leaks are sealed. Day 2, Ron repeated. Yes. And the other 7 days. She said nothing. Ron turned to face the window. She watched his shoulders do something complicated. Rise, fall, the visible working of a person processing something they had half expected and entirely hoped was wrong. When he turned back, his expression had resolved into something quieter, something that was sadder than anger, and therefore harder to face. "Harry will want to know you're safe," he said. "Can I tell him that at least?" "Yes, tell him I'm safe. And Malfoy. Tell him." She paused. "Tell him I have assets in play that I'm not ready to close." Ron looked at her for a long moment, looked at Draco, looked back at her. "Assets," he said. Flat. Not cruel. Ron was rarely cruel, but waited. "Right." He took his leave with the careful economy of someone who had decided to say less than he could, because the situation required it. And she stood at the door and watched him cross the frost-pale ground until the anti-apparition boundary released him, and he turned on the spot and was gone. And the cottage was quiet again, and she stood in the doorway with the cold morning pressing against her face for a long moment before she closed the door. She turned. Draco was looking at her. "You should have told him the truth." "I did. The whole truth." "There isn't a whole truth yet," she said. "There's a partial truth and a great deal of—" She stopped. Her voice had developed an edge she hadn't put there consciously. He crossed the room. He stopped closer than he usually stopped, inside the boundary she had maintained with careful, unspoken consistency. And she held her ground and looked up at him and felt the specific atmospheric pressure of his proximity with every nerve she had. "He could see it," Draco said, quietly. "Weasley. He walked in and he saw it immediately. He saw, whatever this is." A pause. The word hung. "I'd like to know for the record whether you can see it too, or whether you're planning to keep filing it under operational necessity. The bluntness of it, the stripped, direct quality of it, so unlike his usual careful approach to anything that mattered, she felt it land in the center of her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. "I can see it," she said. Something in him changed. Not dramatically. It was never dramatic with him. She had learned that. The important things moved through him quietly, or not at all. But she saw it. "Then what are we doing?" he said. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." Draco. His name arrived without forethought, its shortened form, the first time she had used it, and she watched him hear it, and watched what hearing it did to his expression, the fractional seismic shift of it. "I know what it feels like from my side. I don't know what it... I'm not going to assume it's..." "I stayed," he said. Simple, irrefutable. "I could have left on day 3. You know that." "I know. I stayed because..." He stopped. His jaw shifted. "I haven't wanted to be anywhere in months. I've been existing in spaces and waiting for them to end. And then I woke up in this ridiculous, damp cottage, and you brought me tea and argued with me about Victorian novels, and I wanted..." Another stop. She could see the effort of this, the genuine cost of saying it plainly, which was not in his nature, and which he was doing anyway. "I wanted to be here. I kept wanting to be here." The lamp burned between them. The winter morning pressed pale and still against the window. She said, "I packed 3 novels for 2 years of camping, and I never once read them. I read them out loud to Harry when he couldn't sleep. I gave them to you, and then I sat at the table and pretended to work while you read them. And it was the most settled I've felt since before the war started." He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, a bird called once, some winter bird, sharp and brief, and then was quiet. She thought, "I should say something measured here, something that builds a structure around this, rather than leaving it open to the cold." She didn't. He reached out. His hand, slow, deliberate, with the quality of a conscious decision made in real time, came to rest against her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone, his fingers at the curve of her neck, and she felt the cold bite of his ring against her skin, and the warmth of his palm, and the specific gravity of the gesture. And she let it happen, and she turned her face the smallest fraction toward his hand, the way a compass needle turned toward north, and she felt rather than heard the breath he released when she did. "Granger," he said, soft, almost inaudible. "I know," she said. He didn't move, neither did she. The held moment had a quality she had no architecture for, not tense, not still, but suspended, like the instant before a spell discharged, like something holding all its potential before the world changed. Then he withdrew his hand, slowly, with the carefulness of someone replacing a fragile object. She let him step back. She turned to the table, picked up her quill. Her hand was doing the thing she had learned to recognize over 9 days, the fine, involuntary tremor that appeared when something had moved her past the threshold of what discipline alone could manage. She wrote nothing, just held the quill. Behind her, she heard him sit down, pick up the novel, and she knew with the full analytical certainty she brought to everything she knew that he was not reading it, that he was sitting behind her, not reading a novel in a damp stone cottage in the Scottish borders, while the frost-pale morning moved through the window, and that this, somehow, was enough, was more than enough, was something she did not have a word for yet, but intended, with the thoroughness she brought to everything she intended, to find. She set her quill against the page, began to write. Ron came back the next morning with Harry. She heard the detection ward before she heard them, the specific pulse of it, 2 signatures now, both order, both familiar. And she was at the door before they reached the boundary, and she watched Harry cross the frost-stiffened ground toward her with the particular expression he wore when he was frightened, and was managing it by converting it entirely into forward momentum. He held her for a long time without speaking. She let him. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the cold outdoor air that clung to his coat, and felt, with a completeness she hadn't expected, how much she had missed him. The specific quality of being known by someone, thoroughly and without effort, the way Harry knew her. "You're all right," he said. Not a question. Checking. "I'm all right." He pulled back, looked at her face with those green eyes that had always seen more than they should. She held his gaze and did not look away, which was its own kind of answer. "Ron told me," he said. "I thought he might. Not everything. He said you'd tell me the rest." She looked past him at Ron, who was standing several feet back with his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression at the careful neutral of someone who had made a decision to let a situation develop rather than direct it. She loved him for that. She told him so with her eyes, and watched him receive it and look at the ground. "Come in," she said. "Both of you." Draco was at the table when they entered. He had known they were coming. She had told him when the ward pulsed, and she had watched him receive the information with that quality of compression she knew now was not coldness, but preparation, the particular way he assembled himself when he expected conditions to require endurance. He was sitting very straight with his hands flat on the table, and his face in its controlled arrangement. And she saw Harry see him and watched 6 years of history move through Harry's expression in approximately 3 seconds. Malfoy, Harry said. Potter. The word between them had a different texture than it had carried in school. Not the charged, boyish hostility of adolescence, but something more tired, more complicated, the specific register of 2 people who had occupied opposite sides of something enormous and were now standing in the aftermath of it, trying to determine what the coordinates meant. Harry looked at her. How long has he been here? 10 days. And you didn't tell us? No. Because. She pulled out the chair across from Draco and sat down, and the deliberateness of it, the choosing of that specific chair, that specific proximity. She was aware of it as she did it, and she did it anyway. And she watched Harry see it, and watched his expression do something she couldn't fully read, which was unusual. Because I needed to be sure of what I was dealing with before I introduced variables I couldn't control. Variables, Ron said from the doorway, dry. She chose not to look at him. The intelligence Draco provided. She heard herself use his given name and felt the slight atmospheric shift in the room, Harry's attention sharpening by a degree, Ron going very still in the doorway. She continued without pausing. Is what allowed the order to take roll. The location leaks are sealed. You know this. We know the intelligence was good, Harry said. He had pulled out the other chair, the one across from her, which put him directly facing Draco, and sat in it with the particular quality of someone deciding to engage rather than observe. We don't know what it cost. Nothing was exchanged, she said. He gave it freely. Harry looked at Draco. Why? She expected Draco to deflect, to deploy the compressed, uninflected tone, to offer something minimal and impenetrable. Instead, he met Harry's gaze across the table with a steadiness that cost him something she could measure now, having spent 10 days learning the denominations of what things cost him. Because I was tired, Draco said, of all of it. Harry held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved between them. Not resolution, not forgiveness, nothing as conclusive as either of those, but a kind of mutual recognition. 2 people acknowledging that they had both been shaped by the same enormous pressure from different angles. And now? Still tired, Draco said, but differently. Harry looked at her. She looked back. I need to talk to you, Harry said, alone. They stood outside in the frost-pale morning, she and Harry, a distance from the cottage that was also a distance from the window, and Harry thrust his hands into his coat pockets and looked at the hills for a moment before he looked at her. Tell me what's happening, he said, not unkindly. I've told you, Hermione. Just her name, in the tone he used when he needed her to stop performing competence and simply be honest with him. She had heard it perhaps a dozen times in 7 years, and it had never once failed to work. She looked at the hills, the winter grass, pale gold and silver where the frost still held in the shadows. I don't know how to explain it in terms that will make sense. Try. She stopped, tried again. Over 10 days, I have had more honest conversation with him than I have had with almost anyone since the war started. He told me things about the manor, about what it was like, about... She pressed her lips together. He's not who I thought he was. I knew that Theoretically, I had enough information to know that the person I remembered from school was. That there were conditions that produced him, that the cruelty was not some innate quality, but a... Hermione! She stopped. Do you have feelings for him? Harry said. Simple, direct. The way he asked difficult questions, without architecture. The frost-pale morning held still around her. Yes, she said. Harry absorbed this, the way he absorbed things that were simultaneously surprising, and not, with a brief internal adjustment, visible only in the slight movement of his jaw. He was quiet for a moment. Does he? Harry said. I think so. You think so? He's... She felt the fractional smile before she could prevent it. He's not direct about it, but yes, I think so. Harry looked at the hills. She watched him thinking, the specific quality of Harry thinking, the way he worked through things not analytically, but intuitively, the way he trusted what he felt more than what he could prove, which was the quality that had always most differed from her, and which she had, over 7 years, come to rely on as a corrective to her own tendency toward over-analysis. He was awful to you, Harry said, for years. I know. The things he said, I know, Harry. I'm not telling you not to, he said. I'm making sure you know I know the whole picture. She looked at him. You're not telling me not to. You're the most intelligent person I've ever met, and you've been alone in a cottage with someone for 10 days, and you've made a decision with your whole self, not just your head. I'm not going to argue with that. He paused. I'm going to worry about it extensively. I know, and I'm going to need him to understand. Harry, that if he... Harry, he stopped, looked at her. I know, she said. I know what you're going to say, and I know you mean it, and I love you for it. But I need to handle this myself. He held her gaze for a moment, and then did something she hadn't expected. He smiled, small, complicated, the smile of someone feeling several contradictory things simultaneously. 10 days, he said. In a damp cottage in Scotland. The wards are excellent. I'm sure they are. They left in the early afternoon, Harry and Ron, and the leaving had a specific texture. Harry's hand on her shoulder for a moment, and the look he gave her that contained both warning and permission. Ron's briefer goodbye, the quality of it still complicated, still carrying its unresolved weight, but present, which was what mattered. She stood at the door and watched them go, and felt the wards close behind them like water settling. She turned back to the cottage. Draco was at the window. He had been watching the departure from there, and he turned when she came back in, and the look on his face was the one she had been cataloguing in pieces for 10 days, and could now read in full. The uncertainty beneath the composure, the wanting beneath the control, the specific quality of someone who had learned not to expect things to remain. Potter, he said. He's accepting. He is. I didn't expect that. Harry is better at people than he appears, she said. He feels things very accurately. Draco was quiet for a moment. What did he say to you? Outside. He asked me if I had feelings for you. The compression of his face shifted. And you said? I said yes. The room held this. He crossed to her. She held her ground and tipped her chin up to look at him, and felt the atmospheric pressure of his proximity with the full specific attention she had stopped trying to manage, and his hands came up and found her face the way they had the morning before. Deliberate, careful, the cold bite of the ring against her cheek. And this time He didn't withdraw. "I have been," he said quietly, "entirely unable to think about anything except you for 10 days. I want you to know that. I want there to be no ambiguity about it." She felt her breath do something involuntary. "That's very direct," she said. "You told me to say things plainly." "I did." "So." His thumbs moved the smallest fraction against her cheekbones. She felt it in her spine. "There it is, plainly." She reached up and her fingers wrapped around his wrists, not pulling away, not pulling closer, simply holding. And she felt his pulse there, rapid and real beneath the skin, and the knowledge of it, the simple human fact of it, did something to her chest that she had no clean name for and did not require one. "I have been filing you," she said carefully, "under categories that don't fit you. For 10 days and for 6 years before that, I kept reclassifying what I was feeling because the honest classification was inconvenient," he said. "Terrifying," she said. His expression at the honesty of it did the thing she had learned to look for, the fractional, seismic shift beneath the surface, the layer beneath the layer. "Yes," he said. "That." She looked at him. At his face in the thin winter light, the sharp architecture of it, the specific quality of his attention directed entirely at her, with the full weight of everything he was, unguarded, unperformed, simply present. And she felt the fracture she had been maintaining in her composure complete itself and become, instead, an opening. She rose onto her toes. She stopped with an inch between them, her hands still at his wrists, his hands still at her face, and that inch had a quality, a weight, a heat, a held potential that she felt against her mouth before there was any contact at all. "Draco," she said, his name, again, quietly. "Hermione," he said, hers, the first time. She felt it land in her chest like a key in a lock. She closed the inch. His lips were cold from the window, and then they were not cold at all, and his hands in her hair were gentle with the same deliberate carefulness he applied to everything that mattered to him. And she pressed her palms flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her hands, rapid and real and entirely undisguised, and she thought, 10 days and 6 years before that, and the whole long, difficult distance between who we were and who we are. And here, finally, here. He pulled back by a breath. His forehead came to rest against hers. Neither of them spoke. The winter light moved across the flagstone floor. The lamp burned. Outside, the frost-pale hills held their cold gold silence, indifferent and vast. And inside this small, damp cottage at the edge of a war that hadn't ended yet, 2 people stood with their foreheads together, and their breath mingling in the narrow air between them. And the silence had a quality she had never heard before in any silence. It was full, completely full, the way silences were when they contained everything that needed saying and nothing that required words. She exhaled. She felt him exhale. She closed her eyes and held it. This moment, this cottage, this specific and irreplaceable now, with both hands, the way she held everything she intended to keep. The war ended on a Tuesday. She heard it the same way she had heard everything for months, through the wireless, through coded language dressed as weather, through the particular quality of a silence that followed a transmission and meant something had shifted in the world's architecture. But this time the silence was different. This time it was followed by a voice, unmistakably Harry's, reading a prepared statement in the careful, slightly too formal cadence of someone who had practiced it and was still not entirely sure he believed what he was saying. Voldemort is dead. The war is over. Come home. She sat at the table for a long time after the wireless went quiet. Draco was outside. He had taken to walking the perimeter of the wards in the mornings, not checking them, she understood now, simply moving, the way certain people needed to move when the interior became too occupied. She had watched him from the window on these mornings with the particular quality of attention she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. And she had found something in the simple rhythm of it. His dark coat against the pale winter grass. His breath making small ghosts in the cold air. That settled something in her she hadn't known needed settling. She heard his footsteps on the frost-stiffened ground before he opened the door. He came in and looked at her face and stopped. She said, "It's over." He stood in the doorway with the cold morning air still in his coat and his expression doing the thing she had learned to read in its smallest increments. The compression, the reaching beneath it, the specific quality of someone receiving news that was too large to enter through ordinary channels. His hand came up and gripped the doorframe. One knuckle whitened, then released. "Potter," he said. "Yes, he's alive." He said, "Come home." Draco came inside and closed the door and stood in the small front room of the cottage with its stone walls and its single lamp and its 11 days of accumulated life between them. The books, the notes, the 2 cups always on the table, the chair at the far wall that had become his chair with the gradual inevitability of all things that simply kept happening. And she watched him take the room in with an expression she felt in her own chest like a struck chord. "Home," he said, quietly, tasting the word. That's what he said. "For you, maybe." Not bitterly, she had learned the difference over 11 days between his bitterness and his honesty, and this was honesty in its purest form. "I don't know where that word points for me." She stood up from the table. "Then we figure that out." He looked at her. "Together," she said. "We figure it out together. That's not a small thing I'm saying. I want you to understand it's not a small thing." The winter light from the single window found him fully, the sharp planes of his face, the quality of his stillness, the particular exhaustion that had been resident in him since she had first seen him in the forest. And that was, she thought, beginning. Very slowly, like frost retreating from ground that had been cold for too long, to loosen. He looked at her with those pale eyes that she had read wrong for 6 years and had been reading correctly for 11 days, and felt, she was increasingly certain, something close to what she felt. "You're going to need to be patient with me," he said. "I'm aware. I mean specifically patient, not generally. There are things I have to answer for, formal things. The ministry will... I know. I could be looking at Draco." His name, the shortened form, which she used now without forethought, which had become simply the word for him in her internal language. "I know. I've already thought through the legal parameters. The intelligence you provided is significant mitigating evidence, and I intend to ensure it's properly documented and presented. I also have extensive notes on the specific circumstances of your actions during the war which contextualize." Something happened in his face. "You've been building my defense." She had been building his defense. She had not named it that. had filed it in her notes under contextual intelligence documentation, but standing here with him looking at her like that, she found the honest word was better. "Yes," she said, "since about day 4. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and she tipped her chin up and looked at him with everything she had. Not the careful, analytical attention of the first days, not the managed observation she had practiced for 6 years, but simply looking, openly and without the intermediary of strategy. And he looked back at her the same way, and the room held them both in its damp stone quiet. "Day 4, he said. "The morning you told me about Roll. I started thinking about how to protect you before I'd acknowledged I wanted to." "Very you," he said softly. "Extremely me," she agreed. His hand came up to her face. The gesture had become familiar now, was in the process of becoming one of the things she associated entirely with him. The cold bite of the ring and the warmth of his palm and the specific quality of deliberateness in it. The sense that every time he did this, he was making the same conscious choice. And she leaned into it, the small fraction that she had been allowing herself, that she would allow herself more of now, that she intended to allow herself for a considerable time to come. They left the cottage in the early afternoon. She packed her notes with the same systematic care she had brought to every stage of this. Sorted, ordered, the intelligence documentation separate from the personal record she had not intended to keep, and had kept anyway, filling the margins of her notebook with observations that were not operationally relevant, and that she would not, she decided now, excise. She packed the 3 novels. She left the 2 cups on the table because the cottage had no owner who would care, and she liked the idea of them there. The paired evidence of habitation, of 2 people having occupied a space and been changed by it. Draco stood in the doorway watching her pack with his coat on and his arms crossed, and an expression that contained, she thought, an entire interior monologue he was choosing not to deliver. She had found she could often tell when he was not saying something important. She had found she was willing to wait for those things with a patience she did not extend to most subjects. "What?" she said, without looking up from the notes. "Nothing." "Draco." A pause. "I was thinking about the forest in Northumberland." She looked up. "That's where you found me," he said. "Where I used to go. Somewhere they weren't." He looked at the doorframe rather than at her. "I haven't needed to think about that place in 11 days. She held this. Let it be what it was without reaching for words to put around it. "That's not nothing," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She closed her bag, stood up, looked at the cottage one final time. Its stone walls, its single lamp now extinguished, the 2 cups on the table, the chair at the far wall. 11 days of evidence that something had happened here that neither of them had planned, and both of them had needed with a specificity they could not have articulated before it arrived. "Ready," she said. He looked at her. "Where are we going?" "Harry first, then the ministry. I want to file the intelligence documentation before anyone builds a narrative we have to argue against. Then," she paused, "I don't know. After that, I genuinely don't know. I find I'm not as troubled by that as I would normally be." "You're always troubled by not knowing things." "I know. It's very disorienting." The fractional, almost smile crossed his face. She had a complete catalogue of its variations now, This expression that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same register, and this particular version was the one she had seen first on day 3 and had been wanting to see again ever since. Unguarded, genuine, the smile of someone who had forgotten for a moment to manage what showed. She picked up her bag, held out her hand. He looked at it, then at her face. He reached out, and his fingers wound through hers, cold and deliberate, the ring pressing gently against her knuckle, and she held his hand with the same firmness she brought to everything she decided to hold. "The ministry will be difficult," he said. "Yes. People will have things to say. People always have things to say. About you, specifically, about this." She squeezed his hand once. "I have never once arranged my choices around what people have to say. I'm not beginning now." Something in him. She felt it rather than saw it. A quality of release, like a long-held breath finally let out. His hand tightened around hers. "Granger," he said. Thank you for the tea on the first morning." She laughed. Genuinely the kind of laugh that arrived without preparation, startling in the quiet of the cottage. And she felt him feel it, the way his expression opened at the sound of it with something approaching wonder. And she thought, "I am going to make him hear that again, repeatedly, for as long as he'll let me." "It wasn't poisoned," she said. "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." Outside, the afternoon had cleared. The frost had retreated, and the winter hills were the pale gold of old honey under cold blue sky. And the air had the clean, specific quality that came after long cold finally broke, sharp and clear, and carrying the distant suggestion of something that wasn't quite warmth yet, but was moving in that direction. She set the port key, a different one, a short brass button she had keyed to the outskirts of London, and held it between them, her hand in his, and she paused for a moment before the activation word. She looked at him in the winter light. He looked at her. 11 days ago she had stood in a forest at midnight with her wand in her hand, and made a choice she could not entirely justify, and would not, if she were doing it again, make differently. She had told herself it was strategic. She had told herself it was necessary. She had been telling herself a great number of things that turned out to be partially true at best and willfully incomplete at worst. And she had arrived, through the accumulated evidence of 11 days, at the simpler and more honest version. She had brought him here because something in her had known, beneath all the strategy and the justification, that this was where he needed to be. She wondered sometimes what he would have become, left alone in that forest. How many more midnights before something gave? She would not wonder about it for long. She had his hand and the winter sky, and the whole long, complicated future of the world after a war that was finally, irrevocably over. And she had a great deal of work to do and an extensive list of arguments to construct, and a person beside her who was going to require patience and documentation and the kind of stubborn, thorough loyalty she happened to have in considerable supply. She said the activation word. The world lurched sideways, cold air and bright sky, and the ground vanishing beneath them, and she held his hand through the pull and tumble of the portkey's transit and felt him hold hers. And when the ground came back, it was London cobblestones under grey winter sky, the distant sound of voices, the smell of the city, the world after. She looked at him. His hair had been disordered by the transit, and he hadn't fixed it. And she found, with a completeness she hadn't expected, that the sight of him standing on a London street with disordered hair and her hand in his was one of the most satisfying things she had seen in a very long time. "All right," she said. "Ministry first." "You have a plan," he said. "I always have a plan." He looked at the street ahead, the buildings, the grey sky, the ordinary world proceeding with the slightly stunned quality of a place that had just remembered how to be ordinary. "Walk me through it," she began. He listened with that quality of attention she had learned to recognize as specific to her. Focused, complete, missing nothing. And the winter light fell on them both as they moved through the street, her voice steady and thorough, his hand in hers. And behind them the city filled slowly with the sounds of a world exhaling, unclenching, beginning, with enormous care, to hope. She talked. He held her hand. The street opened ahead of them into a wide grey square, and she kept talking, and he kept listening, and the world kept turning at its ordinary pace, and neither of them looked back at the direction they had come from. Because the thing about finally being somewhere you wanted to be was that the distance behind you ceased to require measurement. She had his hand. He had hers. The rest, she thought, with the calm certainty of someone who had made her most important calculations and trusted the result, was simply everything still to come.
This story started with a simple question. What if the enemy wasn't really an enemy? What if two people stuck together in a small place, with nowhere to hide, just started to see each other? Really see. Not the school version, not the war version, just the human version. Draco and Hermione are opposites. Everyone knows that, but opposites share something important. They both know what it feels like to carry something heavy alone. That's where his story lies, in that space between I can't stand you and I can't stop thinking about you. Hermione didn't plan to keep him. She told herself it was strategy, it was logic, it was a mission. It wasn't. And Draco didn't plan to stay. He had every reason to leave. He knew the door wasn't locked. He stayed anyway. I think that the most honest thing about love, it doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly. Through tea in the morning, through a book passed between two people, through the one person saying, I trust you, and meaning it completely. The war outside was ending, but the real story was always inside the small cottage, in the silences, in the almost moments, in the choosing again and again to stay. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope it stayed with you a little.